In this activity, we are going to be learning about Roman numbers. So, what are Roman numbers? Actually, more than 2000 years ago, Romans had their own number system, and it was completely different from what we are following today. Today, we follow decimal number system, right? Ones, tens, hundreds, thousands, and all that. But Roman numbers had 7 symbols. So it had a symbol I, V, X, L, C, D, and M. And each of these represents a certain number. And using combinations of these numbers, they were trying to represent all possible numbers. Okay, so let's see how this works. So to represent the number 1, they used the letter I once. To represent the number 2, the same letter I was used twice. And then 3 had 3 of the I's. And then when you get into 4, you have to basically have 4 of these I's, right? But none of the Roman numbers have anything where the same symbol gets repeated 4 times. So the maximum that you'll see is 3 times a symbol getting repeated. The minute you get into 4, they started using the next letter. So to use the number 4, what they did was they picked the next Roman numeral. So what was the next Roman numeral after I? It was V. V was representing 5, right? So if you put a I and then a V, that represented 4, right? So I and a V represented 4, and then just a V represented 5, and then V followed by one I represented 6, two I's represented 7, and V followed by three I's represented 8. And again, what will be the next number? It will be V followed by 4 I's, right? Again, 4 of these things cannot get repeated. So what do? You look at the next Roman numeral. What is the next Roman numeral? It's X, which represents 10. Again, to represent the number before 10, just before 10, you put one I and then an X. Right? One I and X represents 10. X represents 10. X and I, X followed by an I represents 11. And X followed by 2 I's will be 12. 3 I's will be 13. Right? Now, what do you do with 14? 14 will be X followed by I and 4. Right? I and V. Right? X followed by 4. 4 is represented by I and V. Right? So that's how they kept on adding numbers. You can go like this till about 39. But the minute you get into 40, then you had to either write it as XXXX. Again, the symbol would get repeated 4 times, right? Again, that's not acceptable. So look at the next Roman numeral. What is the next Roman numeral? It's L. L represents 50. And putting an X in front of an L gives you 40. And then L represents 50. L followed by X represents 60. L followed by 2X represents 70. L followed by 3X represents 80. And again, you cannot put 4X's to represent 90. So what do? You go into the next Roman numeral, which represents 100, right? C, the letter C represents 100. So if you want to get 90, you put an X before C to get 90. And C will represent 100. C followed by an X represents 110, and so on, right? So why do we use the letter C? C represents century, right? Century represents 100, right? So that's how Romans used to represent. And again, this will this will work till you get to about 399. The minute you get into 400, you get into the next Roman numeral D, which is representing 500. So you use C followed by a D to get 400. D will follow 500. DC will represent 600, and so on, right? Till you get 900. When you want 900, you go to the next Roman numeral, which is M. M represents 1000. So if you put a C followed by an M, that will represent 900. And then you keep going on and on and on like this, right? There are two interesting things that I wanted to talk about with respect to Roman numerals. One is, did you ever notice that Romans never had the number 0? All the numbers were represented using the letters that we have seen so far. So why did they not need the number 0? because in our current representation, in our decimal representation, the position of a digit depends on what place it is in. Like, for example, if I am looking at a number like 423, right? So if I write 423, the value of 3 is 3 ones. The same thing if I write it as 324, the value of 3 is 300, right? So in our thing, the digit 3 depends on where it is. Whereas in case of Roman numerals, the value of the letter C is always 100, right? And the value of letter X is always 10. And if I put X and C, we are basically, if I put X before C, we are subtracting 10 from C. And if I put X after C, we are adding 10 more to C, right? But the value of C is always the same wherever I put it. It's always 100, right? So that's why they really did not need the number 0. Another thing that's very interesting, what is the largest number that we can write with Roman numerals? Can you think for a minute and tell me? You can pause the video if you want to think. Okay, so the largest number that we can write with the regular Roman numerals is 3999, right? And how do we write this? We write this as M for 3000. Then I put CMX, and then CIX, right? That represents 3999, right? Now, how about the numbers that are more than this? How do you represent, for example, 4000? What the Romans did was you take the regular number and you put a bar above that. So if I put something like this, 4, and then you put a bar above that, that represents 4000. If I put the regular number X, what does this represent? It represents 10. If I put a bar above it, that represents 10,000. So using this kind of a notation, they could write larger numbers. Just some things that are interesting snippets regarding Roman numbers. But mainly you will need to know the digits that are given here, IVX, LCDM, right? And IVX is very simple, 1, 5, and 10. But how do you remember this LCDM? You can just remember little cats drink milk. L is for 50, C is for 100, D is for 500, and M is for 1000. Okay, so why don't you go ahead and watch this video again, or you just go through the activities, but mainly understand the purpose of each of these letters. And always remember, you can not have 4 of these characters repeating at any point of time. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this activity. And if you have any questions, write to us at support@mathbuddyonline.com.